Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for coming back to this room where we get to continue to dwell in the uncanny valley. When we first put together the 10-year forecast for this last fall, we had a lot longer time, and so we were able to dwell in the uncanny valley of AI, as we've been discussing, but also the uncanny valley of governance, the uncanny valley of relationships, the uncanny valley of work. And that's the piece that we want to invite you into now, is a reflection, welcoming back to the stage our executive director, Marina Gorbis, for taking us just at a very high level into a little bit of what we might expect for the future of economy and work in the uncanny valley. Marina.
Rachel mentioned earlier today that some of the tools we use for thinking about the future, because there are no facts about the future, is we look at signals and we look at trends. The other thing that we like to do, and I particularly like to do, is look at history. Because there are patterns in history, although history does not repeat itself. Mark Twain famously said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. But there are patterns in history that are really important for us to understand. Not that we'll repeat them, but there's something that we can learn from those moments. And when we think about the uncanny valley that we're going through right now with this new set of technologies, the things that kind of I was thinking about is another time when we were going through an uncanny valley. I wrote this article in 2017 and called it our Gutenberg moment. So Johannes Gutenberg obviously invented the printing press, and that invention and that new technology ushered all kinds of transformation. Reformation, of course, scientific revolution, all kinds of new social movements. And the reason it was so transformational, because it changed power dynamics. It changed the power of having a voice. So from one voice to having many people. And it wasn't, if you think about it, it wasn't a very peaceful transformation. It also created a lot of social divisions, the Catholics against the Protestants, the religious doctrine against the scientific doctrine. All kinds of things happened, and including a 30 years war, which was one of the deadliest wars in Europe. Most of the German population was exterminated during that time. So it's interesting to be, hopefully we're not going to repeat that history, and it's not written in stone, but it's really interesting for us to think about that these really fundamental transformations in our communications technology, because they have such powerful social impact, they have this tendency to change lots of things. They have a tendency to change social dynamics. They have a tendency to change how we work, how we think about truth, how we experience our society, and ultimately how we change our economy and how our economy changes. And not surprisingly, for some reason, a lot of people I know have been writing books about end of capitalism. If you just Google end of capitalism, and this is in the last 5 years because I was reviewing a lot of these books, there was a lot of sort of criticism of neoliberalism and capitalism, and it kind of had very similar sort of pattern to it, but there was very little about, well, where do we go from here? Where does it take us? What's the new path, given all these technology and other kinds of transformation, which to me is a kind of a perfect futurist moment, because this is a time for us to imagine all of these different possibilities. And what's interesting is that when you think about some of the work that I've been doing is looking at what's happening with jobs and with work and kind of economic inequality. And if you look back, what you see is that the way we work and the way we organize our society, it's not preordained. It's a product of a lot of different things, of cultural norms, of availability of technology, of our institutional arrangements about our knowledge of science and all kinds of other things. And if you look throughout human history, again, taking this big kind of sweeping view of history, these arrangements have changed over time. You know, most of our lives as humans we spent as hunter-gatherers. Out of some 60,000, maybe 100,000 years of human existence, we primarily existed as hunter-gatherers, which means that we accumulated very little surplus. Of course, then we also lived under feudal conditions or conditions of slavery, where people owned property and people and land. We had agrarian societies where people were cultivating land. And ultimately, if you think about this period of time of capitalism, that's a small part of our sort of human experience, of our human existence, where the primary means, particularly for people to maintain livelihoods, is through wages, through wage labor, where basically you're selling your labor for money. That's about, I would say, 200 years. And again, in the sweep of people's experience, that's a small part of that experience. And what we're seeing is that although these forms of making lives, sustaining our livelihoods were different, there's one thing that stayed very steady, and that's wealth accumulation. So, and the importance of assets. So economists define wealth as all your assets, the price and value of all your assets minus debt. And that asset over time has changed. So in the agrarian times, it was your land. Your land was your primary asset. In the feudal times, it was your land and your property and the people you owned, or the peasants that lived on your estates. And in our more recent history, it's become wages. Wages have become really the primary means for people to sustain their livelihoods. And wages, and it was really the asset became financial asset. It's about money, right? And the reason it's important to talk about wealth is because, as opposed to income, so again, economists define incomes as something that comes into your household that you earn throughout the year, and it's sort of like a river. It comes in and out of your household. Wealth is more like a reservoir. It's something that you turn to in case of emergency. Maybe you lost a job. Maybe you had a health crisis. And wealth is something that determines where you live, where your kids go to school, your social setting, your social connections. So many other things are determined for wealth. So wealth is really important consideration when we talk about resilience and stability. And needless to say that we've had huge and rising sort of levels of wealth inequality. And what we're seeing, and what's important to remember in these times when we talk about artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and all these large language models, is that they rely basically on a new kind of asset. It's our data. You know, you probably heard it that people compare data to new oil, and it's kind of a good analogy and not such a great analogy, because in many ways, like oil, data by itself is not that valuable. You know, oil, if it's just sitting in the ground, is not that valuable, but if you extract it and you process it, and if you convert it to things, it becomes valuable. So there's some interesting analogies to that, and in many ways, what we're experiencing is this very important new type of asset that's been introduced to our economy. And we all exude that asset, maybe without realizing it. If you're wearing a smart watch, if you are going somewhere where data is collected, all the videos that are being created when you go through customs and other areas, every time you use a smartphone, you are basically giving up that asset to somebody. So that's one thing, is just us exuding that asset without probably even realizing that there's a value to it. And of course, the other things that we do is we've created the music. We just had this experience. The music that Chat2IF was creating was based on millions and millions of songs that somebody else has created, the poetry, millions and millions poems, writings, and everything else. It's a human knowledge that's basically been converted into data, and that is creating these new kinds of asset. And of course, there's other kinds of data, which is our city, our federal data. It's not surprising that we're seeing the fights about access to federal data. That data is valuable, and every city, every county, and at the federal level, we are collecting this data that's being converted. And there's, of course, the enterprise data. And so that new asset becomes really important for us to think about as we think about what are the new economic arrangements we're moving into, and who is benefiting from these arrangements. And you can see that there's a kind of a the ownership of these assets is really kind of the new frontier, and not just the assets themselves, not just the data, but all the tools for processing, for storing, for accessing, for analyzing. That is the new wealth and the new asset on which wealth is being built. And if you look at it, you're seeing that actually, look at the companies. These are the companies who have the largest market cap today. And what are these companies? These are the companies who basically have access to those assets, and they extract them and they manipulate them for good and other purposes. And you can see that these are today's wealthiest, basically, enterprises are the ones who are involved in except for Saudi Aramco, which is one of the oil companies. But you can see where the wealth is coming. So this is market cap. And of course, it changes as the stock market fluctuates. But you can see where the greatest value is creating in terms of money. And the interesting thing when we think about the economy, and what's interesting for me, is that these same companies who have this huge market cap are actually not the big employers, right? So a company like Meta, for example, only about 70,000 people who work at Meta. You look at Apple, largest company by market cap, okay, 360,000 people. GM, at its height, had about 2 million people working at GM. You look at NVIDIA, 30,000 people. Even Microsoft, which is a very large company, again, 220,000 people. And who are the largest employers today? It's Amazon and it's Walmart. And those companies, the median wage is about $30,000. So there's something going on here in our economy where, on the one hand, tremendous wealth is being created based on data and based on AI tools, and yet something is not happening there in terms of this kind of wealth is not concentrated. It's not going to workers who are working in those companies and also in other companies. And you can see that workers' share of corporate income has been going down quite substantially over a period of time. And unfortunately, when you kind of take that long view and you're seeing what's happening today, you're starting to see that actually wages for many people are no longer what drives wealth creation. If you look at the wealthiest people today, though it's people who own equity in these kinds of firms. It's people who own these kind of new assets or other kinds of assets like land and property. And it's not, what it means is for many people who are wage earners, it's very difficult for them to create the kind of wealth or accumulate the kind of wealth that gives them that kind of resilience that they're able to tap into for if something happens. So, and it wouldn't be a problem if most people owned these kinds of assets or owned these kind of financial assets. But that's not the case. About top percent of the US households own about 80% of all the stock, that includes in your 401k plans and everywhere else, but it's about 81% of equity on the US stock market. And a lot of people just don't have any of those assets at all. There was just an interesting study. So Joint Venture Silicon Valley is an organization that produces the index of Silicon Valley every year and just came out with its index for 2024. And it showed that the innovation ecosystem, it's sort of bouncing back Silicon Valley, but the wealth inequality in Silicon Valley is growing at twice the rate as the rest of the country and twice the rate of what it is in California. There are 8 households in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, which is the heart of Silicon Valley, who own more wealth than 80% of the rest of the households. That's about 4 million households. So 8 households own as much as 4 million other households in the same area. And that takes me back to where I started, which is a lot of these technologies are driven by Silicon Valley and the unique sort of innovation ecosystem that it has created. And that ecosystem is also has a particular culture and particular set of ways that investments are being done. And it's one of the most unequal places in the US and produces this kind of inequality. And so it's important for us to think about as who is creating these technologies, who is investing in these technologies, and what does it mean for the larger population that doesn't have access to these kinds of really primary assets today. So a little bit of, I think what I'm trying to say is that we're having 2 uncanny valleys at the same time. We have the uncanny valley of our technology, and we have sort of an uncanny valley of our economy that we need to think about, because as these technologies are changing the kind of fundamental sort of nature of assets that give people wealth and access to wealth, we need to figure out ways to do this so that we can do it more equitably.